Capitalism?
I'll do something. I don't know. I just done a very rapid re-skim of the first chapter because it's been a little while since I was reading it. So I have a comprehensive understanding of the beginning, of the end, and the middle. It's something about states and ideology, and
States, ideology. There are world systems involved, and I understand that the hyphen is actually very important. So I can say that and pretend like I fully understand it all.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. I have to explain that to me. I missed the essay on the hyphen, and it's important.
Did you, by the way, I didn't want to forget bringing this up, and I knew I would because it's there's nothing else to do with it in the entire book. Do you remember the part in the book where he's talking about how everybody's is basically going crazy from capitalism and how it's really bad? And then there's just one paragraph where he's like, and capitalism is also destroying all the trees. And then the section just ends. It's just I was like, right on, Wallerstein. All right. It is also doing that.
Yeah. I mean, there were sections towards the end of this where I was just like, are you having a breakdown?
Do you need help?
I know, it felt like there were. I don't know. I don't want. I don't want. No.
Oh, don't spoil the end. Will everything collapse in a good way or in a bad way?
Yeah. Yes. What kind of breakdown?
Yeah. Well, I need to make sure that I don't. In my head, I was really confusing Wallerstein and Bookchin, and I was like, "Why did I do that?" And then I looked up the brief biography of them on the Wikipedia pages, and I was like, "Because they're kind of just the same person, born at the exact same time. Both grew up in the Bronx. Both immigrant, or their parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jewish immigrants. Both probably have strong opinions on the Yankees and the Dodgers. Or at least they did. Kind of just the same person. Or maybe they are the same. Maybe they are the same person. We've never seen them in the same room together. Well, we did the only sensible thing, Dan. We were like, we've been putting off reading Immanuel Wallerstein for too long. And it was suggested to us when we asked Jason W. Moore, we were like, Wallerstein, we're really interested in him. What should we read of Immanuel Wallerstein's? And he was like, you should read all of the Modern World System, volume 1 to 1,000,000. We were like, okay, is there anything
you
shorter?
might be mistaking us for academics of some sort.
Yeah. I just remember both of us nodding.
Very self-conscious pretenders.
Yeah. So we read his short book, the one that everybody knows, which he introduces in this as an essay. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'm not fooling myself. It is just an essay.
I think also this is 2 essays stuck together.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, there you go. Also an essay in the sense that no footnotes, no works cited, no nothing of that going on in here. He just asserts a bunch of stuff and is like, what are you going to do? I'm Wallerstein. You think I'm wrong?
Yeah. I mean, I actually really enjoy that. Maybe because it just doesn't matter to me.
It feels very conversational,
Yeah. I mean, other than it would have been other than a lack of historical examples. If there could have been more historical examples.
But I'm assuming that he knows more about historical capitalism than I do.
Yeah,
or he knew. So hey, I guess capitalism began in the 15th century. My mind has been changed.
I'm quite surprised we didn't come across this book. I mean, in some ways, this is the exact analog. This is for Immanuel Wallerstein's wider corpus. What the Ellen Meekson's book is for Robert Brenner.
Give us a verso book.
This is the verso, 150 pages of not a lot of text on a page, outline of the argument for a layperson, it's just
yes.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised we haven't read this before. I feel like we're one step around the circle of hitting all of the ticking off all the theorists, I guess.
Yeah. Let us know, listener. Give us your favorite academics verso book under 200 pages, and we will read it for the show. All right. You know what, Dan? Happy birthday for when this comes out. Every year, I'm like, I find myself on Engels' Wikipedia page being like, did I get the day right? Is that correct? So yeah, there you go. For when this comes out, there you go.
Remember my birthday. That's how I remember my own birthday.
Yeah, we certainly don't know it by the passage of time. That's not what happened. All right. From the title, everybody, we read, we're going back to Immanuel Wallerstein, although I was thinking about that. I think what we read, was that a Wallerstein essay or was that somebody talking about
I think it was an
Wallerstein?
essay by somebody talking about
Okay, classic.
Wallerstein, yeah.
Classic. So now we're actually reading Immanuel
Yeah.
Wallerstein.
So we have an episode way back in the corpus,
which worries me
called,
because
the world system theory. So don't go back and listen to that.
It worries me because I feel like that was our most listened to episode for a while, and it's like, oh, how many undergrads are just writing incorrect things on their essay, looking for an easier way out. What are you going to do? That's not what this one's going to be.
You are forewarned, undergraduate listeners.
Forewarned, yeah. Use ChatGPT. That'll be much more correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so we read Historical Capitalism. This is a series of essays that Wallerstein turned into a book from 1983. And when I realized that, I was like, you know what? Pretty prescient. This is pretty prescient. Yeah. The student was talking about a lot of things that like a lot of very smart people would act like, they were the first people to realize it in like 2000. So I was pretty impressed. But basically what this is...
Later sections of this do refer to the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think. So maybe the second half is an update. Or
there you go.
Anyway, sorry to correct.
Shame. maybe he was just so on it. He was like, "Come on,
I just saw it coming." I mean, I would not
this
be
will be the month.
This, he's the what's the character called from Foundation? Maybe maybe Immanuel Wallerstein is.
Hey man, if Wallerstein wants to like come out and have a little CGI thing of him and be like, "And here's what will happen next," we'll be like, "Wow, Wallerstein, yeah." And then there will be a moment where it's like, "Wait, but what he said is supposed to happen hasn't happened." Spoiler alert for the second Foundation. What are you going to do? Oh, man, I got to go back and reread those books. Those books are so good. Now I'm just thinking about that. What was that guy's name? Move past that. We read Historical Capitalism. Yeah. Dan, what'd you think of
it? I really enjoyed it. I think I entered into it, I think, a bit combative, and it took me quite a long time to realize that I was being quite combative,
That's funny. I kind of went into it and I was like, yes, we're back to the good stuff, the history of capitalism, and then I got more combative. So did you get less combative?
I think I got less combative. Well, no, maybe I was just being unreasonably combative, and then I moderated myself slightly. Okay, but I mean, like the caricature version of the evolution of the thought of this podcast is we read Ellen Mixes Wood's book, heavily influenced by Robert Brenner's theories about the transition to capitalism, and then cast Immanuel Wallerstein as the great enemy against. We've subsequently encountered Wallerstein's thinking, not just in that essay that we read long ago, but also in the work of Jason W. Moore. Touched on it a few times, but never really engaged with it fully. And I enjoyed this as like a sketch of that wider body of work, I guess. I assume is quite a comprehensive sketch of that. But a lot of it felt very familiar. A lot of it was argumentation that I already thought I knew of as being what Immanuel Wallerstein thinks. But there were other sections that took me by surprise as well. But yeah, I think I entered into it wanting to be really combative, finding little allusions. I was seeing criticisms of Robert Brenner where they weren't really there, and like, and even the title of the book, he's quite keen to like put this to talk about historical capitalism, and I was like, I even imagined that to be some kind of snide remark against Robert Brenner's like ahistorical capitalism. And then I sort of realized, well, no, he's using I've decided he's using the phrase historical capitalism in a way that we would condone, which is simply, and Robert Brenner would condone as well, I would imagine, which is simply to say that capitalism is a historically distinct historical period. With the beginning and the end, and an end.
Yeah, and also,
it took me about 100 pages to realize that I didn't
your blood pressure.
I didn't. I could calm the fuck down and realize that I agreed with him.
Yeah, I think for me, I honestly, I have no recollection of the Ellen Meekson's Wood book touching on Wallerstein. Did it?
No, I don't.
I think I remember there being stuff in there about like, don't just, she's obviously really critical of considering capitalism as being accumulation for accumulation's sake, and that's it, right? And that's kind of like the thesis of this book. So that's where it is. We'll get into that in a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is, it feels like a bit of a quantitative, right? Like Wallerstein's idea of the origin of capitalism. One could imagine a Brennerite making a criticism of it. It is quite quantitative in its analysis of the roots of capitalism. Maybe we'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. Right? We'll get to that. Okay. I think maybe we just say first that you're right. The title of this, he calls it historical capitalism. He's trying to recognize that this is a system in motion, which I think when he kind of described it like that, I was like, you know what? Fully on board with it. I think that's fine. And he is very much like, this is a system, and because it's a system with its own inbuilt contradictions, it will end. And he certainly has some predictions about when it's going to end, which really stressed me out. But I think that approach is a very good one. He's really coming to this from like a systems angle, kind of a different systems theory angle than one that we're used to, but one that I think is still quite good. We've never really spoken about bifurcation. Bifurcation gets brought up a lot in here. But I think generally, like, yeah, I appreciated this. It was certainly a different way of thinking about the origin of capitalism and capitalism's development, one that I'm not necessarily super on board with in some ways. But I think that one of the main reasons people tell you to read Wallerstein if you're like a Marxist is because, you know, you can make no assertions that he is being a, like, you know, the buzz phrase, like methodological nationalist in any way, right? Like the best thing about world systems theory and world systems analysis is that he recognizes that if you want to understand capitalism, certainly currently, you have to understand this is a global system and one that doesn't necessarily like take any actions of just America or just China like for granted. And that might sound like an obvious thing, but there are loads of very smart people, I think, who make this mistake. And some people will accuse Brenner and Wood of doing that sometimes with their analysis of the origin of capitalism and focusing on England. I don't know if that's particularly fair because there's quite a bit in there about like the Dutch and all of this different stuff. I don't know if I really want to relitigate like that whole debate, mostly because I'm not sure I know enough about it. But what I will say is that I think that Wallerstein's work, as like shown in this book, is really useful in a number of ways. Even if, and this is kind of a funny thing to say, but like even if some of his basic propositions I'm kind of not necessarily fully on board with, but smart guy, you know, I'll be the first to say it.
Yeah. I do feel like he has a very particular set of definitions and a very particular set of things that he's focused on, like elements of capitalism, elements of a description of how capitalism works. We would recognize, but I feel like he's selecting a particular set of focuses, right? He has a particular conception of how to describe capitalism, what its primary mechanisms are, what its drives are, and what its sort of breakdown tendencies are. And you know, you could end. I don't even know. Like, I don't know. Do you know whether Immanuel Wallerstein called himself a Marxist? Like,
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there's no Wallerstein without Marx, and I think he gets that. But there's that bit at the beginning of the book where he's like, Marx was a man of his time. I was like, hell yeah, finally somebody said it. And I was like, oh, well, I feel like he's kind of saying that so we can make Marx out to be slightly different than what he was saying, but whatever.
Yeah. I mean, he actually makes what I've decided actually is quite a reasonable critique where he doesn't really talk about Marx very much. He talks about Marxists.
Yeah, fair enough.
And like, he never, I don't think he explicitly says that, like, when he's talking about Marxists or when he's talking about the sort of like communist states that he's sort of criticizing or implicating in the world system of capitalism, he's not making a direct analogy to Marx. And even when he's being because he has a really, I mean, we're not being very vague and not no, but like maybe and to jump into the middle and to start in the middle, I guess. He has a very interesting take around the historic, whether capitalism can be seen as historically progressive, and it's at that point that he sort of makes an allusion to Marx, but really he's speaking about Marxists when he asserts that Marxism, despite having a critique of capitalism, also sees it as a potentially progressive force or a potentially necessary one. Now he's sort of like picking the most caricature case of that, and sort of like speaking about Third International Marxist communism, where a capitalist phase was seen as a necessary development towards socialism. He's making a very legitimate critique of that, and very wisely, I guess, skirts around what Marx's particularly more nuanced version of that argument would have been, I guess. But
yeah, well, I mean, there are plenty of places I'm sure you could find where Marx, it's like, quote from Marx, capitalism is ... historically progressive. Don't read the rest of the sentence. I mean, and I don't know. I don't want to be like that flippant about it, because there are definitely places in Marx where he's probably a bit too, whatever the opposite of reticent is to say that like capitalism is this progressive force. But what Marx is saying. Marx is calling it progressive because of this division of labor that he would believe, without which you can't have a socialist society. And take that with what you will. I think you can, you can criticize that if you want, but he's certainly not saying it's good, Yeah.
I mean, I think I've convinced myself that that's a necessary part of my understanding of capitalism, socialism, is the idea that capitalism is socialized production to a degree that makes possible a more thoroughly socialized form of production in the form of socialism or some later mode of production. And in that respect, like, there is something necessary in capitalism, and what it's done historically. I was quite taken aback by just how skeptical Immanuel Wallerstein was of capitalism in its entirety.
Yeah.
Maybe we leave that for a little while later on. But
yeah, I don't. Let's just mention it now. Like, he has this point where he's like, there is nothing progressive about capitalism. And honestly, that was one of the points where I actually wasn't super like combative with it, because I was just like,
you'd be on board with this.
I was like, you know what? Yeah, that's kind of refreshing. I was like, I'm fine with that. Like, he's missing the entire point that what Marx would talk about why it's progressive, about this division of labor and stuff. Whatever. That's whatever. It's just nice for a change to read someone who is at least influenced by Marx, who is just like, no, the whole thing needs to go and the whole thing fucking sucks. It's like,
and it potentially would have been better had it not happened in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, his point is that, like, and again, I would imagine he knows more about this than I do. His point is that people are worse off basically in every, like, I should rephrase that. The vast majority of people are worse off today, he says, than they were under any previous mode of production. I don't know. I don't know if that's true, but he makes some really excellent, if nothing else, I would say, propagandistic ways of talking about capitalism, when he's like, here are all of the things we're told. Oh, you have a car? Peasants didn't have cars. Capitalism's better. And he's like, there's penicillin now. Okay, but what about access to healthcare? He makes all of these really good points. The main thrust of which is people now work harder than they really ever have in any kind of like large scale sense. You can obviously point to like instances of chattel slavery or whatever, but his point would be like, on the whole, compared to like feudal peasants, people work way harder now to get what they have than they ever have. And for him, that's like bad, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're entirely correct. Like, he makes he makes a very good case for why capitalism is negative, I suppose, and in argument against people who imagine capitalism to be a progressive force that's making people's lives better, and whatever the propagandists for capitalism say. But I think the other thing that I really appreciate about that is just the way, just the sort of like type of historical analysis that he's engaged in. Yeah, I mean, I love I love a counterfactual, right? Or I love imagining, I love a counterfactual. I'm also sort of generally opposed to teleological readings of history. And I mean, one of the things that I enjoy about what I've read of Robert Brenner's work largely through the writing of Alan Weekes Wood, is to remind ourselves that like each historical mode of production is sort of like I guess a distinct mode, and although it sort of like has a set of origins, it has a sort of there's a causal set of historical contingent connections that lead to it emerging. Those things are like historically specific, I suppose, and don't fit into a larger historical process, but they're specific to each transitionary period, I guess. And that ethos is very much in this sort of like historical attitude, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when any time we've read about like any pre-capitalist culture outside of Western Europe specifically, even like Eastern Europe, Japan, China, like it's become very clear that that teleological reading of the transition from like a tributary feudal mode of production to capitalism, you got to get the idea out of your head that like, well, the merchant bourgeoisie, or I guess, yeah, the bourgeoisie were just like bound to succeed and, you know, have their revolution and have their day over the aristocracy, the like landed nobility, because it's just like, well, everywhere else that just didn't happen, and it didn't happen for a wide variety of reasons. And so to kind of be like, well, capitalism, you know, had to come after feudalism or whatever, like it's a pretty weak argument. And you're right. I think all of those people that we've been talking about, like they do a very good job of kind of navigating that teleology of like, you know, first you have this, then you have that. And also, I think the way that Wallerstein here talks specifically about that bourgeois revolution, I thought was really good, where he just kind of mentions that, like, and this is actually something that I felt like was kind of similar to the Brenner stuff, was just that, like, this was an intra ruling class struggle to kind of try. He doesn't use the term status quo, but it's kind of like to try and maintain the status quo. It was a system that was collapsing, appropriation of what little surplus there was in feudalism. It was getting harder and harder to grow that, or even to hang on to what the ruling classes had. So certain sections of the ruling class had to come up with new ways of kind of running things, and this led to this kind of like bifurcation event where a whole new mode of production was born. And I think whereas Meekson's Wood and Brenner are kind of making that argument to make a point about the role that the ruling classes play, well, and not just the ruling classes, but like all classes play in these revolutionary periods, I feel like Wallerstein is kind of more so in this essay making that point to kind of be like, you know, he's pushing back against probably some of the more liberal sociologists that he has to deal with in academia, where they're just like, and some Marxists, obviously, who are like, you know, this was the, you know, enlightened bourgeoisie taking the next step in a teleological history. He's like, it wasn't that at all. It was mainly compromised of people trying to maintain the status quo. Which is good.
Yeah, I was quite struck by the similarity between that and what I remember reading of the sort of Brenner Woods thesis of, as you say, the change in the mode of production coming about through people actually attempting to maintain the status quo to some degree. From reading Woods, I came away with the idea that in some respects that transition was somewhat accidental. Whereas in this, you kind of get the impression that that's not the case. For Wallerstein, it seems to be. And I mean, all the way throughout the argument that's being put forward in this book, there always this element of sort of like politically conscious action being taken by the bourgeoisie. I feel like he makes the ruling class seem very much more class conscious, shall we say, perhaps, than I won't attribute to other thinkers, but like I've imagined other forms of argumentation making, if that makes sense. You know,
Yeah,
I'm reluctant to say what anybody else actually thinks, but as I've been thinking about these things, I guess one always comes up against this contradiction as to whether it's kind of like, is it the system of capitalism playing out and all the agents within it are sort of like somewhat hapless puppets at the whim of the system playing itself out, or what's the degree to which they're sort of like consciously contributing to the development of the system? for me, from reading this book, it very much seems like Immanuel Wallerstein's making a very sort of like a case for conscious action being a really important part of historical development, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, it's tricky though too, because like in revolutionary, it's going to be a trade off most of the time. I'd say like in lead up to these kind of what he would call like bifurcations or like revolutionary events. It is going to be just like the laws of motive production playing itself out and people doing what they can to kind of like stay afloat. We can compare that to kind of like what's going on now, I would say. But then in revolutionary periods, it's incredibly obviously like, groups of lawyers from in and around Paris coming together to be like, we need to do like a bourgeois republic now. So, there'll always be some elements of that. Yeah, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I also found really interesting the element of that argument where he's saying that like the people that are at the very top of the class hierarchy in 1400 are the same people or the same groups of people that are at the top of the hierarchy in 1600 and basically in 1900 as well. He's kind of making the case that like it's the same people, it's the same class in a different like form of class relation, I guess. But like,
well, it is probably a lot easier to buy a factory if you own an estate.
If you already own it,
and like, so
yeah. Maybe maybe he's making a very obvious argument there. I don't know.
Yeah. I feel like it. Yeah, that feels like something where it's like, how are you actually using this data? What does this actually mean? You know what I mean?
But I guess it's quite an important correction to the kind of like the most caricatured version of the idea of the bourgeois revolution, where there's like a totally different class takes over.
Yeah, and they come from nowhere. Yeah, exactly. Or they pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Yes. They were industrious peasants. So if we go back to the beginning, I think just quickly, this is the thing that bothered me. And to be fair, it was actually close to the beginning. When he talks about defining capitalism, it's interesting. It's very interesting because basically the way that he defines it on a kind of abstract level, and to be fair, he is like, wary of making large claims in the abstract about, especially historical systems. But when he defines capitalism, it's basically a system defined as like an ever expanding accumulation of more and more capital for its own sake. And it's like this out of control spiral that you can historically pinpoint where it begins. And for him, it begins a little bit earlier than like the kind of typical Marxist-y, like Brennery stuff. For him, it's like the 15th century when people there starts to be a clear change for him between like merchant capital, which is mainly just like arbitrage, right? It's like, corn is cheap here and we can grow plenty of it. So let's take it somewhere else and sell it for really expensive. That's basically merchant capital versus like constantly chasing capital for its own sake. And in previous modes of production, he says that this wasn't necessarily possible because there was insufficient commodification of every aspect of like the economy, not just the productive cycle. Like he says that labor power wasn't commodified, which is obviously very true. He talks about, markets not being as important to certain things. You can tie this into the enclosures, although he doesn't really like get into that. And again, he pinpoints it like in the 15th century. And I don't know. It's an interesting way of defining capitalism. It's one that I don't think necessarily gets at exactly what is historically specific about capitalism. In a way, it seems like it does, because what he's saying about this difference between merchant capital and like capitalists and capital with a capital C, right, is pretty on the money. Like, it is correct. But I think maybe if you're trying to do the thing where you're trying to figure out what capitalism is and when it originated, you kind of have to be a bit more specific about like, well, what is it that actually caused that? And what were the changes in social relations that necessitated this constant chasing of capital for its own sake, right? Because like, yeah, that constant chasing of capital, I feel like, is kind of like an outgrowth of a necessary, it's a necessary outcome of a given set of social relations, that given set of social relations being private property, right? Like, and I'm not trying to say that I have like any more accurate date for when capitalism started, or even to say that his date is incorrect, really. But I just think that like you'd probably want to look for when private property really started to become the dominant form of property, and then also when that necessitated a kind of like production for exchange, obviously, which is basically what he's talking about, but when that also necessitated a like search for where these different private producers can get a leg up on other producers, and that inevitably winds them looking at wage labor, basically, and Marx's theory of surplus. So again, it's interesting. It's certainly like, this is the thing where I was like, okay, this is probably what like the Brennerites always critique, and I think rightfully, about like a quantitative view of what capitalism is versus maybe one that's a little bit more qualitative. But I'm also not trying to say that it's entirely useless, because that is part of capitalism, but I just don't think it gets at what necessarily defines it.
Yeah, I think I agree. I agree with that. Yeah, I had a similar reaction. It sort of feels a bit like he's jumped a few rungs down the chain of what are the significant elements of capitalism, kind of thing. Like, it's obviously a drive toward accumulation is a constituent part of capitalism. Obviously, a relationship to sort of wage labor is a central part of that. But as you say, you point out very clearly that like there isn't actually really an origin point here. There isn't a point of when do people start acting differently? When do we get a different relationship to the idea of private property and the way that private property is sort of like intersects with wage labor, such that this new focus on increasing the productivity of labor, the further extraction of surplus value from workers, becomes the sort of like key driving force for the ruling class, and leads to this exponential like increase in economic growth, sort of like increasing surpluses. I feel like he's starting from from what we know about Immanuel Wallerstein, and this conception of the world system, like there's always an inside and an outside. It sort of feels like he sort of needs capitalism to be there to then start his description of the relationship between the capitalist core or the capitalist world and that which exists external to it. One of the things that's interesting in this is that it almost, with capitalism here, I suppose with other times we've interacted with the work of Immanuel Wallerstein, it's usually been in relation to ideas of the relationship between core and periphery in the world system. You've already got a central capitalist core, and you've got a relationship to an exterior where there's some kind of like form of primitive accumulation happening, such that like sort of external wealth is external to the capitalist mode of production, can be brought in and used as a sort of part of the generating the new wealth, or the sort of a new accumulative process. One of the things that is interesting in this, he sort of seems to dial that all the way back to a relationship of internal and external that can almost happen at the point of the genesis of capitalism. It doesn't necessarily mean a relationship between Spain and South America. It means a relationship between the capitalist employer in some village somewhere and the relationship to, and that employer's relationship to the workforce, to the workers there. This all kind of hinges on this idea that he has of the degree of proletarianization. And he makes this really like, I don't know whether it's true or not necessarily, but I hadn't ever heard it before and found it really interesting that like he's making the claim that, rather than, like, I would have imagined the obvious assertion to make would be that capitalism has this naturally proletarianizing tendency, like it strips people from the land, it takes them out of other class relations, and it subjects them to the social relations of capitalism. It makes them workers, it makes them generators of surplus value, so that can be extracted by capitalists. He's kind of making the argument that capitalism almost has an interest in slowing that process of proletarianization. He wants workers to stay outside of, or sort of partially in and partially outside of, the wage relation. He thinks that capitalists want workers to stay partially in and partially out of the wage relation for as long as possible, because for as long as like the sort of like new proletariat can be also supplementing the costs of their living from non-capitalist relationships, whether they're like some kind of other continuing to exist feudal relationship, or whether it's the relationship internal to the family where some portions of the family do work that maintains the family such that another portion of it can go out to work. He's making the argument that for the early capitalists, maintaining that sort of portion of social life which is external to capitalism for as long as possible is of a benefit. So I found it one thing that I find quite interesting is that sort of scaling down of that inside-outside relationship to like almost the smallest possible unit of productive life, I guess.
Yeah, that was really interesting. It was really, I'm glad you bring that up. I completely forgot about that, even though it's like a main part of this book. But it is a really interesting way of thinking about exploitation versus appropriation, I guess, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this definitely got me thinking about the Jason W. Moore, because again, we were saying before this, it seems like that is quite a bit more influenced by Wallerstein than we thought, but he takes it to some really interesting conclusions. I think like when I was reading this, I kept critiquing it from a like a almost like a modern gender theory perspective, because, or like a feminism perspective, because I was like, an argument like this, exploitation versus appropriation, inside the value producing zone versus outside whatever capitalism doesn't really care about, like that was kind of well critiqued by critiques of like autonomism or whatever, where it's like, well, it's not that women aren't necessarily, predominantly women obviously doing like housework, aren't being like remunerated for their, it's not like capitalists aren't paying for that work for the social reproduction. It's just it's being paid, but it's being controlled by the man, right? And in a similar way, I was like, well, then I don't know if that necessarily, like this idea of capitalists wanting that version of like work that's appropriated really holds up. But then I remembered like what he's talking about is like historical capitalism, right? Like he's talking about when capitalist social relations came to places historically, they wanted people to be doing a lot of this work completely on their own dime. And I think in that sense, it holds up, because it's like they were probably growing food, which was a large part of their sustenance still. Depending on where you are, this probably lasted for longer or shorter periods of time. But it's an interesting idea where it's like capitalists, on one hand, there's this contradiction where they require everything to be fully commodified and blah, 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 including like, they need workers to be dispossessed as much as possible. But individual capitalists will be like, well, actually, if I just employ somebody that's like, growing loads of potatoes or whatever, that's, those people will take lower wages than the fully proletarianized workers living in the city or something. Again, it's a really interesting idea. One that I don't have the empirical evidence one way or another to say like that is what happened. But it opens up really interesting conversations, and I think necessary conversations about like, well, what is it that capitalism values? And then on the other hand, like, what is it that capitalism like requires to not be valued, if that makes sense? Like, ecologically, this is a pretty easy question to answer, because it's like, well, it certainly seems like to a certain level, capitalism does require a large thing of fossil fuels, right? There's a debate there, but like, let's just work with the information we have. Like, capitalism to be kickstarted seems like it does require some amount of like unpaid work in the form of like coal or whatever, right? Or oil or stuff like that. Now that that's running out, that's like kind of a crisis for capitalism. In other sectors, economics and stuff like that, the role that appropriation plays, I think, is maybe a bit more open to debate, but I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to say. I don't know what you think, to say that like there certainly is an element of the world economy that capitalism does just appropriate. And yeah, I'm just not sure to the extent to which that was correct, like historically, for this thesis.
Yeah. I don't. Well, what it makes me think of is it makes me query what it is that he means by accumulation, because obviously he does understand that like a central aspect of capitalism is the fact that like capitalists exploit the workers by extracting surplus value from them, by paying them less than the value of the sort of like products that they produce. But there's also this second meaning of appropriation where coming back to like Jason W. Moore and this idea of free gifts of nature, like capitalism is also appropriating. I suppose maybe you've already answered this question. It's a distinction between accumulation and appropriation, right? Like the capitalists are accumulating the outside and appropriating the work of workers internal to the capitalist class relation, I guess. But whereas, like, neither of us would say, I suppose, that capitalism could go on forever in that sort of like generating a surplus from exploiting workers. His crisis tendency is very much predicated on the lack of the sort of ever decreasing external. And once capitalism has fully like accumulate, sort of like appropriated the globe, it's at that point that it falls into crisis almost immediately for him. So that's why it has this logical resistance to full appropriation, I guess. It's not to say
Well, yeah, and again, that's just, I guess, just one of the inherent contradictions. I mean, you could just tie this into a theory of imperialism, right? Like a Marxist theory of imperialism, where it's like capitalism just constantly saves itself by finding not just new markets as such. And I think he's right to be like, it isn't just finding new markets. It's also finding and kind of like creating the conditions that create much cheaper labor. Yeah, and I think that's something that like almost all Marxists would agree on, right? That like, that is a way that capitalism has saved itself. And this is a large crisis tendency because there's no Southeast Asia, there's no East Asia, right? Necessarily left, maybe, never say never, but yeah.
I think, yeah, it's interesting. It's I like that you bring up this idea that like, he's sort of criticizing that sort of crisis tendency that people bring up whereby capitalists are running out of people to sell their labor to, and that's why imperialism happens, because they go out there to find new markets. His entire focus throughout all of this is like, how cheap is the worker? How cheaply can you buy the labor? And he does tie that, because something that I didn't respond to earlier on that you were saying, like, what is sort of the nature of this system, I guess, the global system. And one of the things that's so compelling about him, as he sort of moved so thoroughly beyond like a fixation on states or particular places, and sees the globe as one whole system. And it's sort of like how that system oscillates, how the different elements of it move around, how different elements relate or their relations change. And he sort of implies that one of the tendencies is a movement of production away from the core to these periphery places. I sort of find that idea of sort of it's an obvious thing, right? We know that capitalists seek cheaper labor in other parts of the world. But yeah.
Yeah, well, he's also kind of got an overproduction crisis tendency thing going on, and like what's funny is I don't think unequal exchange is something that we've really ever necessarily like touched on. One of these days we probably should. We've never really gotten into those debates, but he is certainly working within the framework of unequal exchange and a theory of overproduction for crisis, where it's like there just aren't enough people to buy these commodities anymore, and that's kind of like the root of crisis. Yeah, I don't know. Recommend us some stuff to read, people, but I don't know, that smacks a little bit like kind of, I'm a little bit suspicious of that idea that it's like there's crisis because there's just not enough people to buy the goods that are being produced. Like, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure that's part of it. I'm sure that's definitely part of it, but like it would seem like there are more fundamental like problems with the way that capitalism produces that lead it to crisis points, and that overproduction like may or may not be a terminal crisis for capitalism. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it certainly does overproduce sometimes. So, what are you going to do? Should we talk a little bit more about like some of the ideological stuff? Because I think this is where a lot of like the really good stuff in this is. He talks about like something that we've touched on a lot, which is like a critique of a lot of these main bourgeois ideas, mainly like universalism. He kind of ties universalism, racism, and sexism together in a really interesting way, I found, where it's like racism for him isn't like, well, I suppose I should say racism to him, the type of racism that he's talking about is historically unique to capitalism. And I found this pretty compelling because he makes a distinction between xenophobia of the past, right, which still exists in some forms, obviously, today, which he kind of defines as this like fear of the stranger, which, you know, you could imagine like an English peasant in like 1200 being like the fear of the Saracen, the fear of like, you know, like Saladin or something like that. And they just have no concept of what like Kurds or Arabs like actually are. And, you know, if they were ever to meet one, they'd be like, they don't have scales? What? Wow, crazy. He contrasts that with like capitalist racism, which he says is like structurally basically necessary for the whole system to function. And he defines it less as this kind of like fear of something different or of something that you don't understand or of this like the stranger, right? And more as like this post hoc justification of the inherent hierarchy of the workforce, right? It's like this justification that certain groups of people are just born to do certain types of jobs because of the inherent qualities that that group has. And you need an ideology to justify this like very obviously unnatural state of things. And that's where you just get racism, right? Where you get, you know, yeah, I mean, people know racist stereotypes. We don't have to get in them, but like you can very easily compare racist stereotypes that have been born under capitalism to a justification of, yeah, the stratification of the workforce, which for Wallerstein is a necessary part of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. And he seems to be making sort of tying that in to a very, it's not just an abstract claim about like dividing people or like keeping some people down or maintaining and sort of abstract hierarchy, but I sort of got the impression there was also a more concrete element to it where it's like there are material benefits to the reproduction of the workforce by having, you know, certain groups of people together, associate together, having there be a certain expectation that you'll do certain types of work, or sort of or like go through a particular type of training process or whatever. So just like creating natural groups within the global system has a knock-on benefit of like just facilitating the smooth running and the smooth reproduction of the workforce in particular tasks or in particular areas.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's, I'll just jump in because I think that's a really important point, because that is another type of appropriation I would say that capitalism does, where like it artificially lowers people's labor power because a lot of the training that's necessary, you know, to, I don't know, like work in agriculture in California is done kind of like in the household, right? Like, you know, California, wow, the like liberal utopia, but like there are just children working in like agricultural fields when it's like 100 degrees out, right? You know what I mean? And those people are, you know, probably, you know, we always think about capitalism as like this complete meritocracy, but it's like generally you probably do something similar to what your parents did, statistically speaking. You know what I mean? So it's like a lot of that is being done in the household. And for him, that's like, yeah, it creates this kind of like concrete material incentive to reproduce like really fucked up workforce.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I can't really remember what else he says about this sort of like interplay, tension between the sort of universalizing and the traditional kind of thing. I quite like the way he frames. He sort of like he's criticizing a kind of romanticizing of tradition, sort of imagining there's some surviving elements of a pre-capitalist world in the form of like regional or cultural tradition or and he's sort of making the counter argument to that no, it's all been completely appropriated, you know, there is no like outside in existence kind of thing. This is what you were saying, you know, this external world is this is a sort of cultural can't use the phrase cultural appropriating. Appropriation of cultures on the basis of sort of like traditional externality functions as a sort of like aid to the system, you know.
Yeah, we're canceling Wallerstein. He's culturally appropriating his ideas. Going back to kind of one thing on this, and then one thing that we also kind of talked about at the beginning, what did you make of when he was talking about this kind of universalist, you know, ideology of capitalism, and specifically its incarnation in like the belief in progress? Because obviously this is something that we've come across, critiques of capitalism, this bourgeois ideology, that it's like we're ever working towards, you know, the perfect society through slow reforms and everything is progress. AI is progress, right? Mm-hmm. More and more people are saying that's very clearly not the case. but specifically, what did you make of, what's your take on how he applied this to like Marxism and socialists? Maybe I should say socialists, because I think he does too, where there's this, he thinks it's a major theoretical, but almost more importantly, like strategic blunder to have this same trust that you saw obviously in the Soviet Union, but then also with like a lot of socialists around progress, around this idea of progress. And he critiques socialists for basically not breaking with this theory of universalism that he says is entirely bourgeois. What'd you make of that?
I mean, I get it. It seems to be what he's implying is that like the all of the sort of like traditions of socialist thinking that have amounted to anything in the world have actually just served to strengthen the world capitalist system rather than to pose any particular threat to it. Which, see, I mean, given what we know of how the Soviet Union ended up like sort of structuring its productive forces, I guess, or how it pursued, how the sort of like the sort of developmentalist ideology sort of has taken over or took over sort of how these states understood how they were supposed to develop and grow and build their economies. It certainly would fit into that line of argument, I guess. But yeah, I can't remember what his more sort of like abstract critique of universalism was.
Yeah, I think it was a bunch. I think it's like meritocracy and
Mhm.
the search for eternal truths in the face of like the last century of
I mean
science being like,
that tension between like uh, the promise of meritocracy and the way capitalism or the sort of how the capitalist system um, actually disguises within an argument for meritocracy a reinforcing of class relations. You know, like what are the how is it that certain people are seen as meritorious, um, forgetting for a moment the degree to which like the privilege to which you are born is going to benefit you um, in this competition to appear like you have merit, but also like just how is the global system judging people, and on what grounds are they judging people? And clearly it's just predicated on how useful are you going to be to the thriving and surviving of the capitalist world system. And so I guess by falling for that trap, you know, for trying to um very nobly, I suppose, like sort of like improve the conditions for people in the primarily in the core of the global world, um by trying to like make people be able to achieve that, you're actually just funneling people into this nexus of compete for capitalism, compete to um, seem meritorious on a very particularly strict set of grounds, kind of thing. So I found that quite compelling, that kind of argument.
yeah, definitely. And it's also like his idea for like what that does for the vast majority of people too, where it's like,
Yeah,
and here are the people that are willing to do the really things needed for
yeah.
capitalism, and
Here's the
there's
vast
everybody
majority of
else.
people that are outside. You know,
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
let's not like look at the consumptive power of people in the UK or the US and imagine that capitalism is doing um, is you know, improving people's standard of living globally, because like just look at the working conditions in the sort of global south or the far east that's allowing for this consumptive lifestyle in the core of the global system, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean that always looking his relentless focus on the impoverished and the outside and the peripheral um, is definitely laudable. It's something that you can easily lose sight of, I guess.
Yeah, and lose sight of it again, and kind of what he's critiquing a lot of socialists for doing about this idea of progress, where it's like, regardless of what your take is on how progressive capitalism has been, it's like it's probably not a particularly like well thought out, you know, propaganda to have when you're talking to like normal people anywhere, let alone in like the periphery. You know what I mean? It's like, no, 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 trust us, this was good. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So I think fair on those lines. I think maybe the last thing, unless you had something else to touch on, I wanted to just mention his like future predictions. he seems I think honestly to have like a very level-headed view of the future kind of like century, I suppose, where he basically just says, look, for all of these crisis conditions that have been outlined here, all of these contradictions inherent in capitalism, it's actually probably not going to last much longer. He says like maybe at like 2050 or maybe in like 2100 it'll all collapse. And for him it isn't a question of will capitalism collapse, it's just a question of when, which I think is very fair. But then he makes the point, which I think is again very good, where he's like, but that doesn't mean we're immediately just going to get socialism, and it also doesn't mean that we're going to get anything better, because realistically it's either going to be a similar thing that happened with the collapse of feudalism, where the ruling classes need to figure out ways to protect their position and to exploit the producing classes, or I mean, or it's all going to collapse, or you're going to get some sort of radical egalitarian, you know, global way of figuring things out. And this is like the nice option, which we'll just basically call socialism. And he even uses the phrase neo-feudalism, right? When he's like, we might get, that could be, we could just have something like that, which I thought was very funny. But
he wasn't prescient enough to put the preface techno on the start of it.
yeah, that would take other great minds to do. But yeah, it's interesting because actually, here's horseshoe theory, Dan. This part of, I think, these essays really came around to actually work quite well with where Brenner, I think, is at with his thinking now, and the kind of essay that we read with that him and Dylan wrote. We would go look up that person's name. I forget. Sorry. Which was basically like trying to analyze Bidenism and Trumpism in this era of stagnation and what it means to have a ruling class politics when there's no promise of growth ever really happening again on any kind of meaningful scale. And him and Wallerstein kind of seem to be saying relatively similar things, because, he's saying that the ruling classes, whether, conservative or more reformist, they both are trying to deal with the same fundamental question, which is they're trying to figure out how to give the kind of like middle class cadres, this is kind of like a classic Wallerstein thing, I think, the promise of a share of the pie that comes from their own, and obviously the exploitation of many other workers who are not in that position of privilege, but also kind of give the working masses, maintain this kind of Wilsonian promise of reform. And he basically just says that's not going to last that long at all. And part of that made me kind of hopeful, because I was like, oh, thank God, fucking Trumpism just isn't going to work, and it's all going to fail, and we're going to have to get socialism, and Bidenism isn't going to work, and we're going to have to get socialism, whatever. But then on the other hand, it's like, maybe this just global political gridlock where the fascists kind of are trying to be fascist, but they can't really take power. And then the kind of like people before profit / your party / progressive wings also kind of can't really take power because they can't mobilize enough people. But then also the like labor parties of the world and the Democrats, they also can't answer this fundamental question of how to keep promising every, sociological strata of society a piece of the pie when there's less and less pie to go around. Maybe that just keeps going for a long time and it just all slowly gets worse. Seems like that's probably the most likely thing, other than the sudden bifurcation. But yeah, I don't know. I was like, am I hopeful after reading this? Or am I just much more depressed? I don't know.
I mean, he definitely doesn't offer the comprehensive transition theory to how you get to socialism, or even really a political sort of like outline
Yes.
for what that would be. Just like a hypothetical, what that kind of would look like. I did appreciate.
He gives two, Dan. He says there's the Saddam Hussein option, or there's the Ayatollah Khomeini option. Just kidding.
Which are autarky or total war with the West.
Yeah, total build nuclear weapons and use them.
Yeah. But it isn't like that. But like that's the sort of like apocalyptic kernel of his crisis theory, right? Is a kind of like, you've got this world capitalist system and it's held together by these fudges to some degree. There's the kind of like constant effort to appropriate from external sources, and a sort of like capitalism has reached the point where, as you said before, like there's no second China. There's no billion workers ready to enter the global workforce. Like there's just like there is no external to that capitalist process anymore, and also, as you say, like it's clinging itself together. I mean, it's for a lot of my reading of this book, I was constantly like, why this focus on culture so much? Why this focus on politics so much? But you make me realize that obviously what he's doing is like this sort of cultural, political, ideological edifice is really central to holding the system together. And obviously he's just sort of seeing all these cracks appear, and seemingly the most likely outcome is some kind of disintegration of the global system into, regional powers, into sort of large enough states that can survive under some kind of autarkic model. Or I can't remember how he prefaces his predictions for what fascism will look like, but he also sort of like preempts the global mass migrations that we're now starting to see, in the form of the ever looming small boats crossing the English Channel, kind of thing, as it exists in the ideological minds of the British, anyway. But I did also appreciate the degree to which his conception of socialism recognizes the degree to which capitalism has sort of exhausted the world's ability to give, and there's going to have to be a degree to which any progressive system that people are able to cobble together out of this disintegrating global capitalist system will have to be have to exist within certain constraints that are the result of capitalism's exhausting of the earth, I guess. Quite literally. I mean, he does talk about biodiversity and the soil at one point in this. So
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The one thing that makes me think a lot about what you're saying about like the culture stuff is that, it really feels like people's, even the most dogmatic people on like the reform side and the kind of like, and I'm not going to throw your party under the bus, so I'll say the labor side, like, or the green side, maybe that's a better example. Like, it seems like the ideological hold those parties have on people, and I know this is going to sound like absurd because of the like violence that specifically, like obviously, like the right is able to mobilize. It seems like the ideological grasp that all these political parties have is actually really tenuous, as crazy as that sounds, because they're able to mobilize very large groups of people, both the kind of like multicultural neoliberalism thing, even the like progressive politics stuff, but even like sooner, like surely, this is famous last words, surely the segment of the voting bloc that makes up the kind of like Trump / reform part of those parties, like surely sooner or later those people do have to realize that their lot has continued to get worse under Trump, and when reform is in power, it will continue to get worse under them. It's just a matter of like all of the hatred, I guess, that's been stoked up amongst those workers. Like, can that just go away? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It just feels like people have these very online takes that are just purely ideological. And when it comes down to it, it's like none of these parties really anymore, and in the coming decades are going to be able to offer people that much. And I hate to say if that's kind of true for like all of the social democrats too. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Although I guess they're offering hope, but so are all the other parties in their own fucked up ways. So,
I mean, the only thing they're going to be able to offer is a vision of what it could be like under worse conditions for you. Like
yeah,
like we reform might not be able to give you anything, but you could be working in a Chinese sweatshop or fleeing like a genocidal civil war somewhere, or like I don't know.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
so hate the boat people, and
yeah, exactly. But I mean, again, there's also like the flip side of that question where it's like, how much longer can these political parties actually offer their real base of support, which is the like capitalists that make up their funding and stuff, right? It's like, yeah,
that's the important constituency.
Yeah, I mean, honestly. Okay.
Oh man, I'm not able to cheer you up, Jack.
it's been funny. I will say it's been very funny moving from first America, then to England, and now to Ireland, and seeing like the exact same, well, not seeing because anybody can see that, but like experiencing the exact same strategies that the Social Democrats in their respective countries, that the fascists in their respective countries that they have. And it's just like, it is all kind of the same. It's just an element of like, to what extent are any of those movements really developed in any given place? That changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll read more Wallerstein in the future. Eventually, you know what? Eventually, we will read all 1 million volumes of the modern world system, and we'll really get to the bottom of it.
Look forward to that.
Yeah. Until then, we'll just read once a year. We'll read an Ellen Meekson's Wood essay, and use that as our ideological base. Yep. All right. Well, great. As I said, happy birthday, Dan. Happy birthday, Angles. We'll be back with something else. I enjoyed this. Bye. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.